This video will talk about the CarForms utility, which is part of the admin tables. To get there, you simply click the button, but do not check the box. We will describe what the box checking means later in this video. So clicking the CarForms button brings up this screen. So there's three distinct parts to this screen. There's the list of forms. There's a list of filters for the forms. And there's a list of selections of how you want to display the forms. So as of the date of this recording, we've got about 1,100 forms in our database. But most of those forms are obsolete or replaced. So my project during this year is to go and figure out what forms are actually being used and get rid of the rest. I think I can get it down to about 300 forms from the 1,100 that are there now. The first digit of the forms is significant once you get to a 5-digit form. So here you see the 1 is the first digit for the bank contracts. If we scroll down, we'll see that 2 is the first digit for the proof of insurance. 3 would be for warranty, 4 for gap, 5 for others, 6 for government, 7 for dealer, and 8 for legal. Right now we're showing all of the forms, but if we wanted to zero in on just one group of forms, let's say the government forms, you can click on that filter button, and you can see that all we have showing are the forms starting with the number 6. In this demo database, all of the forms are active, but an actual user will only have forms that he needs active, and I'll show you how to do that later. So to delete the forms that are inactive, you can click this box. Doesn't do me any good because they're all active. But for a typical user, it'll greatly compress the forms that are listed on the screen. The sort selection are the radio buttons, and I can sort on name of form, that way. I can sort on, by default, on the number, which is this first column. I can sort on preference, which is to say forms that have a number in this column. And I can sort on the revision. Now the revision is over here on the end, on the other side of these little @ signs. So that doesn't do you very much good unless you show them in reverse form. So now the revisions are the first thing that you see there, and that's what you're sorting on. Let's take a look at a Washington title app. You can see here is the form. The revision doesn't appear to be at the very top, but in this case, it's down here at the bottom in the lower left-hand corner. The first column on these forms is the ID. The second column, under the A, if a 1, says it's active for the deal program, and all of these forms are. And if it's a 0, then the deal program won't see them, and most of the user forms will be in that condition. The column under the I means they're active for the inventory program, and there are very, very few forms that the inventory program can process. The numbers under the K, if they are non-zero, gives you some more filtering, such as I can indicate that this form should only be used if the buyer is a Native American. Or I can indicate that this form should only be shown if the buyer is out of state. I'll get to these more later in the video. The letters under the T are either T or F, true or false. And when T means that this form is designed for use with a trade-in. The letters under the E indicates whether the form itself is a text-based form or an older code-based form. I've been spending a lot of time over the last few years to get rid of the code-based forms, and I'm down to maybe only 1 or 2 realistic code-based forms. So most of them are now text-based. The numbers under the first P, if non-zero, means that this is a form that can be printed directly to a laser or inkjet printer. And if they are 0, then that means they are pre-printed forms and must be printed by the Okidata hard copy printer. The last P is a thing that indicates that this form by default should show up on the preference list. As you know, in the deal program, by default, you get a list of forms that are the preference list, which you most likely need to complete this deal. However, if you select the full set of forms, then you get all the forms that are active for your system. Again, in this test database, all forms are active, but a typical user, that would not be the case. So if there is a number in this P column, then those forms will always appear in the preference list unless there is a filter thing in the codes. That's what this 12 and this 11 mean. The actual numbers that define a preference form are meaningless, except that when I display these forms in the deal program, they will be sorted by these preference numbers. So if you want to move the preference forms around, you just simply change the numbers so that the form furthest down has the highest number. There are 4 exceptions to the rule. The bank contracts, the proof of insurance, the gaps, and the warranties all have multiple possibilities that a dealership could use. We have to know from the company that is chosen to be used exactly what form to use. For the bank forms, you can see here the form pointer points to the form in the 1 series, which are the banks, and it points to the proof of insurance pointer, which is the 2 series. The warranty and the gaps are defined by the spreadsheet forms that allow you to configure them, and there's an associated form with each warranty or gap company, and those would be the forms used when you select that warranty or gap company. If we look back in the list of forms, here in the 10000 form, I list 80 as the preference number. So any bank form selected will be at position 80, but the specific bank form selected has to be chosen in the finance company dialog. It's the same thing with the proof of insurance. Here we have 85. Warranties, in this case, are 90. And gaps, the 40000 is 95. To find out more about a form or to configure a form, you can select it by clicking on it, and you get this screen popping up at the bottom of the display. This first set of radio buttons under the default printer shows whether it's a hard copy printout or a plain paper printout. Hard copy goes to the Okidata. That is to say, you have a pre-printed form that you put in the Okidata, and all we're going to do is fill in the blanks. The plain paper goes into a laser printer, and we're going to print both the background and the foreground of the form. The second one is mostly relevant for hard copy prints. That is to say, whether it's a letter size, which is 8.5 by 11, the legal size, which is 8.5 by 14, U-long, which goes all the way up to 30 or 40 inches long, 8.5 wide. Basic isn't used. PDF selection means that we are printing out a background that is a PDF form, but which we're not filling any data in. The print engine says whether it's code or text. If you remember a few minutes ago, I said that the original forms that were created were all Okidata based, and therefore code was used to print on them. About 10 years ago, I started using a template-based way of generating forms, and that's called the text-based forms. Almost all the forms nowadays are text-based. The rip size for Okidata-based forms shows the size of the little rip-off thing at the top that holds all the various pieces of paper together. And if a number is entered there, then if you decide you want to rip off the page and print them one at a time, there's a selection in the deal program that lets you say subtract off the rip size so that everything will print correctly. It's almost never used. Multiple is becoming obsolete. It was a way for scanned forms to print multiple pages. There's now a better way of doing that. The few forms that are using that feature, I'm phasing out. If the trade-in box is selected, then that means this form is designed to use only for vehicles that have a trade-in. The scan box is for when you have a scanned image. You have a background that has to be merged into the text you're going to write over it. That's no longer my primary way of doing things. The second checkbox, PDF Direct, says we're going to be able to process a form directly from a PDF background. The technology that I used for the scanned documents wouldn't let me do that. If you have a PDF background, you need to check both of the boxes, Scanned and PDF Direct. These two sets of boxes are for indicating whether a form should be printed or not. This first three sets of forms says they allow weekly payments, irregular payments, or optional equipment selections to be done with this form. The problem with pre-printed forms is they don't often give you space to do certain things. And so if a form doesn't allow a weekly payment, for instance, then you want to deselect that button. These are sort of the opposite. If selected, it says you cannot use this form with a gap. This is mostly oriented towards purchase orders where there's no space to put a gap in it, or in this case, a warranty. Level 1 is a little strange in that it allows you to print a form by the deal program where no deal has started. This would be something like the buyer's guide, where you might want to print it out, but you haven't started a deal yet. The insurance button pops up the insurance dialog button, so that would be used for the proof of insurance forms, the section 2 sorts of forms. Without that being checked, the pop-up box won't come up. Likewise for due bill, if you're printing out a due bill form, you want to pop up the due bill dialog box that you fill in what you're dealing with. If you need to have a recent odometer reading, then check this box, and if you don't have an odometer reading from the last day or so, I'll pop up a box that says, please give it to me. There are some cases where we don't want to print a form if perhaps the data is old, so by checking this box, if a deal is more than 2 days old, it's going to warn you. It's not going to prevent you from printing it, but it'll at least give you a warning. Here you see the title of the form, which you can see up here. And then after the @ sign, you can see the revision data, and this is now an active field. So you can actually change the revision data in this form. There is a way to change the title of the form, but I'm not going to tell you. But however, you can give a form an alias. By putting a name into the alias column, instead of Carousel Software purchase order showing up, you might want to say just purchase order. And that's what you'll see on your form selection. Dealer specific is very rarely used now. In fact, it's really only used for buyer's guides. And that tells me which buyer's guide to use when the inventory buyer's guide button is clicked. I thought earlier on I was going to have more need for it, but it hasn't worked out. The deal flags and the inventory flags say that a form is active for deals programs or active for inventory programs. Most forms are deal only. Some forms are deal and inventory, and there might be a very, very few forms that are inventory only. I can't think of any. You remember we talked about the preference number. Preference number that you see on the screen comes from this entry box right here. If it is 0, then generally there will be no preference, except in some rare cases that I'll talk about. The government codes, if I click this button, you can see there's a list of codes here. It's mostly filtering for when you have a strange or rare set of conditions where you want to put a form out. So for instance, a Washington dealer may have an Idaho buyer, and there are some forms that you might want to use when specifically you are a non-Idaho dealer, but you have an Idaho buyer. Same thing with Montana and Oregon and Washington. Or just generally the dealer and the buyer are not in the same state. The buyer is an American Indian. The buyer is a wholesale buyer. The deal has pickup payments, or it's a finance deal. These are things that might be expanded over time. What you would do is you would put in a preference number, which indicates you're going to display the form always, but then this would filter it and you would only display it under certain circumstances. Likewise, checking this trade-in button says you only display the form when it is a trade-in, even though there's a non-zero number in the preference button. And finally, we get to the page position. The top part, the page positions with the X and the Y, allows you to move the whole page of print up or down, left or right. The Y controls the up or down, and you can see it says minus is down, and the X controls left or right, and you can see minus is right. This works for the Oki data and for the laser forms. In the case of the CS2 PDF forms, unfortunately, the signs are reversed. So plus is down and plus is right. The scanned position is for those forms that are scanned, which is to say a BMP form or a PDF form where we're going to print the background, and that allows you to adjust the background up or down with the Y offset or left or right with the X offset. With the CS2 PDF forms, which I'm starting to convert to, you almost never need any numbers in those columns. It pretty much lines up perfectly every time. You can display an actual image of the form by clicking this button. So here is an image of the purchase order form, the one created by Carousel. If we go back to the list of tables, on the CarForms button, there is the checkbox. I said generally you don't check it. If we do check it, then you'll see all the same data we saw before, but now in a spreadsheet format. The spreadsheet format allows you to make changes to a whole bunch of forms all in at once, rather than having to go through each individual form with a dialog box and change things there. However, there's no protections. So if you mess up, it's messed up. Pretty much Carousel is the only people that should really be handling the data this way. I know this was a long description of this tool, but it is the most complicated tool that we have in the admin program. The 3 tools that will be described following this will be much, much shorter videos. The next one to be described is the finance company.